The bus wheezed to a stop outside Camp Lejeune, its brakes hissing like an angry serpent as Sergeant Rivera watched another group of fresh recruits stumble off into the Carolina heat. Among them stepped a young woman with dark hair, pulled back in a regulation bun, her duffel bag slung over one shoulder with practiced ease. Corporal Zara Blackwood had driven 12 hours straight from her hometown in Montana, but her posture remained straight, her eyes alert as she surveyed the sprawling training facility before her. The other recruits clustered together in nervous groups, their voices carrying across the asphalt as they tried to mask their anxiety with bravado. 3 particularly loud Marines in training had already singled her out, their sneers visible even from a distance. The tallest one, a broad-shouldered recruit with arms like tree trunks, nudged his companion and pointed in her direction. His name was Danny Kozlov, and he had played football at a Division II college before enlisting. The shorter Marine beside him, Marcus Webb, had grown up in Detroit and considered himself street smart. The third member of their impromptu alliance was Tommy Chun, whose family had immigrated from Taiwan when he was 5, but who now spoke with a thick Boston accent that made him sound like he had been born in Southie. Before we dive into this story of hidden strength and unexpected courage, drop a comment and let us know what state you're watching from. Maybe you have seen situations like this in your own military community or witnessed someone prove their doubters wrong against all odds. Zara pretended not to notice their attention as she checked her paperwork one final time. Her orders were crisp and official, signed by Colonel Patricia Hayes herself. The signature meant something in military circles, though most of these recruits would not recognize the name or understand its significance. Her grandmother had served with distinction in 3 different conflicts, earning medals that now sat in a shadow box above the fireplace back home in Billings. Danny Kozlov strutted over with his chest puffed out like a rooster entering a henhouse. "You lost, princess. This ain't summer camp. Maybe you should have signed up for the Coast Guard instead." Marcus and Tommy flanked him on either side, forming a semicircle that blocked her path toward the processing center. Other recruits began to notice the confrontation, some stopping to watch while others quickened their pace to avoid getting involved. A few female recruits shot sympathetic glances her way, but continued walking, unwilling to make themselves targets on their very first day. Zara adjusted the strap of her duffel bag and met Danny's gaze without flinching. "I'm exactly where I need to be," she replied quietly. Her voice carried a calm authority that seemed oddly mature for someone who looked barely old enough to have graduated high school. Tommy snorted with laughter. "Did you hear that, boys? She thinks she belongs here with the real Marines. I give her 3 days before she is crying for her mommy and begging to go home." The morning sun beat down mercilessly as more recruits gathered around the growing spectacle. Sergeant Rivera watched from his position near the processing building, his weathered face showing mild interest but no inclination to intervene. This was part of the process, the natural selection that would weed out those who could not handle the pressure of military life. Marcus stepped closer, invading her personal space in an attempt to intimidate her. "You know what happens to little girls who try to play soldier, right? They get broken. Maybe not today, maybe not tomorrow, but this place will chew you up and spit you out." Zara's expression remained neutral as she absorbed their words. Her father had warned her about this moment, the inevitable test that would come from those who believed women had no place in combat roles. He had served 2 tours in Afghanistan and understood the culture she was walking into. The key was not to respond with anger or defensiveness, but to demonstrate through actions what words could never prove. She shifted her weight slightly, a subtle movement that went unnoticed by the 3 Marines blocking her path. Years of training had taught her to read body language, to anticipate aggressive moves before they happened. Danny was all bluster and show, his muscles impressive, but his stance sloppy. Marcus favored his right side, probably compensating for an old injury. Tommy was the wild card, smaller, but potentially quicker than his companions. "Look at her, just standing there," Danny continued, his voice growing louder to attract more attention. "She thinks if she acts all quiet and mysterious, we will be impressed. Newsflash, sweetheart, This is not some martial arts movie where the underdog gets to prove everyone wrong. A drill instructor finally emerged from the processing building, his voice cutting through the morning air like a blade. "All right, you maggots, enough socializing. Time to find out if any of you have what it takes to earn the title of United States Marine." The crowd began to disperse reluctantly, but Danny held his ground for another few seconds, staring down at Zara with undisguised contempt. "This conversation is not over," he whispered just loud enough for her to hear. "We'll be watching you, waiting for you to screw up. And when you do, we will be there to remind everyone that some people just do not belong." Zara picked up her duffel bag and walked toward the processing center without acknowledging his threat. But as she moved past him, something in her eyes flickered for just an instant, a glimpse of steel beneath the surface that none of them were prepared to recognize or understand. The processing center buzzed with controlled chaos as dozens of new recruits filled out paperwork and received their initial gear assignments. Zara found herself assigned to 3rd Platoon alongside Danny, Marcus, and Tommy, a coincidence that felt more like deliberate placement by the drill instructors who enjoyed watching recruits sort themselves out through conflict. Staff Sergeant Miguel Santos stood at the front of the room, his voice booming over the nervous chatter. "Listen up, recruits. For the next 13 weeks, your previous life does not exist. You're not civilians anymore, but you're not Marines yet either. You're something in between, something that needs to be forged through fire and discipline." Zara sat in the 3rd row, her paperwork completed with military precision while those around her struggled with basic forms. Her handwriting was neat and efficient, each letter formed with the kind of attention to detail that comes from years of practice. Behind her, she could hear Danny whispering to his companions, his voice dripping with mockery. "Look at her trying so hard to impress everyone," he muttered. But she practiced filling out those forms at home in front of her bedroom mirror. Marcus chuckled quietly. "Probably has little pink weights at home, too. You know, the kind they sell at Target for housewives who want to feel strong." The comments continued throughout the morning orientation, a steady stream of verbal harassment designed to break her concentration and confidence. Other recruits began to notice the pattern, some joining in with nervous laughter while others simply looked uncomfortable but remained silent. When lunch arrived, Zara carried her tray to a table near the windows, hoping for a few minutes of peace to process the morning's events. The cafeteria food was standard military fare, designed for nutrition rather than flavor, but she ate methodically without complaint. Her father had taught her that fuel was fuel, regardless of taste. Her momentary solitude ended when Danny and his crew approached with their trays, surrounding her table like predators circling wounded prey. "Mind if we join you, Princess?" Danny asked with false politeness as he sat down without waiting for an answer. Tommy plopped down across from her, his grin wide and unpleasant. "We were just wondering about your background. What made you think you could handle Marine training? Did you win some participation trophy in high school sports?" Zara continued eating without acknowledging the questions. Her grandmother had once told her that silence could be more powerful than any verbal response, that sometimes the best way to handle bullies was to refuse them the reaction they desperately craved. Marcus leaned forward, his elbows on the table. "Come on, we are all friends here. Tell us about yourself. Did Daddy pay for some self-defense classes? Maybe a little karate at the local strip mall?" The questions grew more personal and invasive as the meal progressed. They wanted to know about her family, her motivations, her fears. Each inquiry was designed to chip away at her composure, to find the crack that would cause her facade to crumble. Other recruits at nearby tables watched the interrogation with a mixture of fascination and horror. Some of the female recruits looked like they wanted to intervene, but lacked the courage to make themselves targets. The male recruits seemed content to let the drama play out, grateful that someone else had become the focus of unwanted attention. Staff Sergeant Santos appeared beside their table without warning, his presence immediately commanding attention from everyone within earshot. "Having an interesting conversation, recruits?" His voice carried the kind of quiet authority that made grown men nervous. Danny straightened in his chair, suddenly aware that his behavior was being observed by someone who mattered. Just getting to know our fellow Marines, Staff Sergeant. Building unit cohesion like you taught us. Santos studied each face at the table, his experienced eyes missing nothing. Unit cohesion is built through mutual respect and shared hardship, not through intimidation and harassment. I suggest you remember that moving forward. The drill instructor moved away, but his message was clear. Danny's face flushed red with embarrassment and anger, emotions that would need an outlet later. Marcus and Tommy exchanged glances, understanding that they had crossed a line, but unwilling to back down completely. Zara finished her meal in the uncomfortable silence that followed Santos's intervention. As she stood to clear her tray, Danny grabbed her wrist, his grip firm enough to leave marks. "This is not over," he whispered through gritted teeth. "Santos won't always be around to protect you." She looked down at his hand on her wrist, then met his eyes with a steady gaze that seemed to pierce straight through his bravado. "You should let go now," she said quietly, her voice carrying an undertone that made something deep in his chest tighten with unexpected unease. Danny released her wrist as if it had suddenly become too hot to hold, confusion flickering across his features. There had been something in her voice, something that spoke of consequences he was not prepared to face. But the moment passed quickly, replaced by renewed aggression fueled by his wounded pride. As Zara walked away, she could feel their eyes following her every movement. The real test was just beginning, and she knew that Staff Sergeant Santos would not always be there to intervene. The coming weeks would require every ounce of discipline and self-control she possessed, but she was more prepared for this challenge than any of them could possibly imagine. The first week of training began before dawn with the harsh blast of reveille echoing through the barracks. Zara was already awake, having learned years ago to rise before her alarm, a habit that served her well in the regimented military environment. Around her, other recruits stumbled from their bunks in various states of confusion and panic. Physical training commenced immediately after morning chow, and Staff Sergeant Santos wasted no time separating the prepared from the pretenders. The obstacle course stretched across 2 acres of unforgiving terrain, featuring rope climbs, wall traversals, and mud crawls designed to test both physical capability and mental determination. Danny attacked each obstacle with brute force, his football background evident in his powerful but inefficient movements. He completed the course in respectable time, though his technique left room for improvement. Marcus struggled with the upper body challenges, his street fighting experience providing little advantage against military-designed obstacles. Tommy surprised everyone with his agility, his smaller frame allowing him to navigate tight spaces and climbing challenges with unexpected grace. But when Zara's turn arrived, the 3 antagonists positioned themselves strategically to watch her anticipated failure. She approached the first obstacle with measured calm, her movements economical and precise. The rope climb that had challenged several larger recruits seemed almost effortless as she ascended using a technique that conserved energy while maintaining steady progress. Her form was textbook perfect, suggesting training that went far beyond weekend warrior fitness. "What the hell?" Tommy muttered as she cleared the wall traverse in half the time it had taken him. "Where did she learn to move like that?" Marcus frowned, his earlier confidence beginning to waver. Maybe she's just naturally athletic. Some people get lucky with genetics. But Danny refused to accept what his eyes were showing him. She probably practiced on playground equipment as a kid. This stuff is not real combat. Wait until we get a hand-to-hand training. Then we will see what she is really made of. The following days brought weapons training, field exercises, and classroom instruction on military history and protocol. Zara excelled in academics, her test scores consistently ranking in the top 5% of the platoon. Her marksmanship was equally impressive, clustering shots in the center ring with a consistency that caught the attention of Gunnery Sergeant Frank Morrison. Morrison was a 20-year veteran with tours in Iraq and Afghanistan, a man who had seen enough combat to recognize natural talent when it appeared. He watched Zara's shooting stance with professional interest, Noting the subtle adjustment she made between rounds and the way she controlled her breathing during the firing sequence. "Where did you learn to shoot like that, recruit?" Morrison asked after she had finished her qualification round. "My father taught me, sir. We hunted together when I was growing up in Montana." Morrison nodded approvingly. "Good foundation. Keep practicing, and you might make expert marksman before graduation." The praise was overheard by Danny and his crew, adding fuel to their growing resentment. They had expected her to fail spectacularly, to provide them with ammunition for their harassment campaign. Instead, she was consistently outperforming half the male recruits in the platoon. That evening in the barracks, the tension reached a new level as Danny confronted her directly. "You think you are hot stuff, don't you?" he said loud enough for everyone to hear. "Making the rest of us look bad with your show-off routine." Zara was cleaning her rifle with methodical precision, each component receiving careful attention as she performed the required maintenance. "I'm just trying to meet the standards they have set for us," she replied without looking up from her work. Marcus joined the confrontation, his voice carrying across the sleeping area. "Standards? You're trying to make us look incompetent. This is supposed to be about teamwork, not individual glory." Other recruits pretended to focus on their own gear while listening to every word. The female recruits kept their heads down, unwilling to draw attention to themselves. The male recruits were split between those who secretly admired her performance and those who felt threatened by her success. Tommy stepped closer, his voice dropping to a menacing whisper. "You know what happens to people who try to make their teammates look bad? They find themselves without backup when things get serious. Maybe you should think about that next time you decide to show off." Zara finally looked up from her rifle, her eyes meeting each of theirs in turn. The same calm confidence that had unsettled Danny at lunch was there again, that sense of someone who possessed knowledge they could not fathom. "I'm not trying to make anyone look bad," she said quietly. "I'm just being myself." "Being yourself is the problem," Danny shot back. "This is not about individual achievement. This is about fitting in with the team, about knowing your place in the hierarchy." The conversation was interrupted by the appearance of Corporal Lisa Valdez, the senior drill instructor for the evening shift. Her presence immediately changed the dynamic in the barracks, and the three antagonists quickly dispersed to their own bunks. But as the lights went out and the barracks settled into uneasy quiet, Zara could feel the weight of hostile attention focused on her position. The real test was still coming, and she knew that her continued success would only escalate their determination to break her down. The second week of training brought combat simulations and team exercises designed to test coordination under pressure. 3rd Platoon was divided into fire teams of 4, and through what appeared to be random assignment but felt deliberately orchestrated, Zara found herself paired with Danny, Marcus, and Tommy for the urban warfare simulation. The exercise took place in a mock city constructed from shipping containers and plywood, complete with windows, doorways, and hidden positions for opposing forces. Each team was tasked with clearing buildings while avoiding simulated enemy fire from instructors armed with paintball weapons. Danny immediately assumed leadership of their fire team, his football captain mentality asserting dominance over tactical planning. "All right, people, here's how we're going to do this." Marcus takes point, Tommy covers the rear, and Princess here stays in the middle where she can't screw anything up. Zara studied the mock urban terrain with calculating eyes, noting sight lines and potential ambush points that the others had missed. The building layout favored defenders, with multiple elevated positions and limited approach routes. A frontal assault would be costly and ineffective. "I think we should consider alternative entry points," she suggested quietly. "The main entrance is an obvious kill zone." Danny turned on her with barely contained fury. "Did I ask for your opinion? This is my team, and we do things my way. You follow orders and keep your mouth shut." The exercise began with the sharp blast of an air horn, and Danny led them directly toward the main entrance, just as Zara had predicted would happen. The result was immediate and devastating as Sergeant Rodriguez emerged from second-story window, his paintball weapon marking all 4 team members with bright orange paint before they had advanced 20 feet. "Exercise terminated," Rodriguez called out. Fire Team 3 is eliminated. Report to the debriefing area. Danny's face burned with embarrassment as other teams witnessed their spectacular failure. Several fire teams were still engaged in the exercise, moving carefully through the urban maze with tactical precision that highlighted the amateur nature of their approach. During the debrief, Staff Sergeant Santos analyzed each team's performance with clinical detachment. Fire Team 3 demonstrated poor reconnaissance, inadequate tactical planning, and failure to utilize team member input. The result was predictable elimination within the first 2 minutes of the exercise. Other teams had achieved varying degrees of success, with Fire Team 1 actually completing their objective by using coordinated movement and communication. The contrast was stark and humiliating for Danny, who had prided himself on his leadership abilities. After the formal debrief, Danny cornered Zara behind the equipment shed, his anger no longer constrained by the presence of authority figures. "This is your fault," he hissed through gritted teeth. "You distracted me with your stupid suggestions right before we started." Marcus and Tommy flanked her as they had on the first day, but this time their body language was more aggressive, more threatening. The failure had wounded their pride, and they needed someone to blame other than their own inadequate planning. "You think you know better than me?" Danny continued, stepping closer until he was invading her personal space. "You think your little suggestions would have made a difference?" Zara remained perfectly still, her breathing controlled and her posture relaxed despite the threatening situation. "Actually, yes," she replied calmly. The side entrance was unguarded and would have provided access to the stairwell without exposure to the second-floor positions. Tommy laughed harshly. "Listen to her, still trying to Monday morning quarterback after we already failed. Maybe next time you should just follow orders instead of trying to be some tactical genius." The harassment continued for several more minutes, each accusation more personal and vindictive than the last. They blamed her for their failure, for their embarrassment, for the fact that other fire teams had performed better using strategies she had tried to suggest. But something had shifted in the dynamic between them. Where before their hostility had been based on assumptions and prejudice, now it carried the weight of actual failure. They had been given the opportunity to prove their superiority and had instead demonstrated their inadequacy in front of their peers and instructors. Zara absorbed their verbal abuse without responding, but her eyes tracked their movements with the kind of awareness that comes from extensive training in reading aggressive behavior. Danny was losing control of his temper, his hands clenching and unclenching as he struggled with the urge to escalate beyond words. Marcus was feeding off Danny's energy, his own frustrations amplifying the group dynamic. Tommy seemed more calculating, watching for opportunities to strike at her confidence while maintaining plausible deniability. When they finally exhausted their immediate anger and moved away, Zara remained behind the equipment shed for several minutes, processing what had just occurred. The failure of their fire team had accelerated the timeline of confrontation, pushing them toward a breaking point that was approaching faster than she had anticipated. She knew that her continued competence would only make things worse, but backing down or deliberately failing was not an option. Her father had taught her that respect was earned through consistent performance, not by making others feel better about their own limitations. As she walked back toward the barracks, Zara caught sight of Gunnery Sergeant Morrison watching her from across the training area. His expression was thoughtful, suggesting that he had witnessed at least part of the confrontation behind the equipment shed. The question was whether his observation would lead to intervention or simply continued monitoring of a situation that was clearly escalating beyond normal recruit rivalry. The third week of training brought the dreaded Crucible exercises, 48 hours of continuous challenges designed to break weak recruits and forge the survivors into Marines. Sleep deprivation, physical exhaustion, and mental stress would reveal who possessed the inner strength to earn the title they all sought. Zara had prepared for this moment her entire life, though none of her fellow recruits understood the depth of her preparation. While they worried about the physical demands, she focused on the psychological warfare that would accompany the official challenges. Danny and his crew had been planning something special for the Crucible, their whispered conversations in the barracks making their intentions clear. The exercise began at midnight with a forced march carrying full packs across 15 miles of rough terrain. 3rd Platoon moved through the darkness like a serpent, each recruit struggling to maintain formation while fighting fatigue and disorientation. The instructors moved alongside them like shadows, watching for signs of weakness or failure. Zara maintained position in the middle of the formation, her breathing steady and her pace consistent despite the weight of her pack and weapon. Around her, other recruits began to show signs of strain as the miles accumulated and the terrain grew more challenging. Danny had positioned himself directly behind her, his heavy breathing and occasional stumbles betraying his struggle with the pace. His pride prevented him from acknowledging his difficulties, but his labored respiration told a different story about his conditioning level. About halfway through the march, Marcus developed a severe leg cramp that threatened to drop him from the exercise entirely. The instructors watched with clinical interest as his fire team faced their first real test of unit cohesion. Would they leave him behind or find a way to help him continue? Without hesitation, Zara moved to his left side and took part of his pack weight, distributing the load to help him maintain forward momentum. Her action surprised everyone, including Marcus himself, who had spent weeks treating her as an enemy rather than a teammate. Tommy appeared on Marcus's right side, following her example despite his obvious reluctance. The three of them formed a human support system that allowed Marcus to continue moving forward, though Danny remained behind them, watching the display with conflicted emotions. Staff Sergeant Santos observed the interaction from his position alongside the formation. Unit cohesion under stress was one of the primary indicators he used to evaluate recruit potential, and Zara's immediate response to a teammate's distress spoke volumes about her character and training. The march concluded just as dawn was breaking over the training area, and 3rd Platoon had successfully completed the first challenge with all members still functional. But there was no time for rest, as the instructors immediately transitioned them to the next phase of the crucible. Combat simulations followed the forced march, with each fire team facing increasingly complex scenarios designed to test their ability to function under extreme stress. Sleep deprivation and physical exhaustion multiplied the difficulty of every task, separating those with genuine mental toughness from those who merely appeared strong. Danny's leadership continued to deteriorate as fatigue compromised his decision-making abilities. His commands became increasingly erratic and his temper shorter with each failed exercise. Marcus and Tommy began looking to Zara for guidance, though they tried to hide their dependence from their nominal leader. During a particularly challenging building clearing exercise, Danny made a tactical error that exposed his entire team to simulated enemy fire. Instead of acknowledging his mistake, he turned on Zara with renewed venom, blaming her for failing to warn him about the obvious trap. "You saw that ambush coming," he accused loudly enough for other teams to hear. "You let me walk into it on purpose to make me look bad." The accusation was both false and revealing, demonstrating Danny's growing paranoia and his unwillingness to accept responsibility for his failures. Other recruits began to notice the pattern of blame and scapegoating that had emerged within Fire Team 3. Zara absorbed his verbal assault without defending herself, understanding that any response would only escalate the confrontation. But her silence seemed to infuriate Danny even more, as if her refusal to engage was itself a form of disrespect. The crucible exercises continued throughout the second day, each challenge more demanding than the last. Recruits began dropping out as the physical and mental stress exceeded their capacity to continue. Those who remained grew closer together, bonded by shared suffering and mutual dependence. But within Fire Team 3, the dynamic continued to deteriorate as Danny's leadership failures mounted and his resentment towards Zara intensified. Marcus and Tommy found themselves caught between loyalty to their original alliance and growing respect for someone they had initially dismissed. As the Crucible entered its final phase, the stage was set for a confrontation that would determine not just who earned the title of Marine, but who possessed the character to deserve it. The breaking point was approaching, and everyone involved could feel the tension building toward an inevitable explosion. Gunnery Sergeant Morrison continued his careful observation of the evolving situation, his experienced eye recognizing the signs of impending crisis. The question was whether intervention would be necessary or if the recruits would resolve their conflict through the natural selection process that had always been part of military training. The final phase of the crucible brought hand-to-hand combat training, the moment Danny had been anticipating since the first day. Here, he believed, his size and strength would finally prove his superiority over the woman who had consistently outperformed him in every other aspect of military training. Drill instructor Gunnery Sergeant Rodriguez demonstrated basic combat techniques to the exhausted recruits, his movements precise and economical despite his compact frame. The key to military combat is not brute force, he explained while executing a perfect takedown on a volunteer. It is leverage, timing, and the ability to remain calm under pressure. The recruits were paired off for practice sessions, and Danny immediately volunteered to partner with Zara, his eagerness poorly concealed beneath a veneer of helpful teamwork. Finally, he thought, an opportunity to put her in her place while maintaining plausible deniability about his motivations. Marcus and Tommy watched from nearby as the pairs began their practice rounds. Both had developed conflicted feelings about their original alliance with Danny, his increasingly erratic behavior and leadership failures weighing against their shared prejudices about female Marines. Rodriguez called for the first technique, a basic escape from a front chokehold. Danny gripped Zara's throat with unnecessary force, his fingers pressing harder than required for the training exercise. She executed the counter move flawlessly, breaking his grip and stepping back with controlled precision. The instructor nodded approvingly before moving on to demonstrate the next technique. Danny's face showed frustration at her competent defense, his expectation of easy dominance already proving false. They progressed through increasingly complex techniques, each one revealing more about Zara's extensive background in combat training. Her movements were textbook perfect, but more than that, they carried the fluidity and confidence that comes only from years of dedicated practice. Danny's attacks grew more aggressive with each exchange, his desire to dominate overriding the safety protocols that govern training exercises. When Rodriguez demonstrated an arm lock technique, Danny applied it with vicious intent, twisting Zara's wrist beyond the necessary angle. She absorbed the pain without flinching, but her counter-response was swift and decisive. The reversal left Danny on the ground, gasping for air, his own technique turned against him with clinical efficiency. Other pairs stopped their practice to watch the brief exchange. Rodriguez appeared beside them immediately, his trained eye having caught the escalation. "Problem here, recruits?" His voice carried warning and authority in equal measure. "No, sir," Danny replied while struggling to his feet. "Just practicing the techniques as demonstrated." The instructor studied both faces carefully, noting the tension that crackled between them like electricity. "Good. Remember that training partners are teammates, not enemies. Safety is paramount in all exercises." As Rodriguez moved away, Danny's humiliation transformed into something darker and more dangerous. The public nature of his defeat had wounded his pride beyond simple embarrassment. Marcus and Tommy exchanged glances, recognizing the shift in their leader's demeanor. The combat training continued for another hour, with Zara consistently demonstrating superior technique, while Danny's performance deteriorated under the weight of his emotional state. His movements became sloppy and predictable, his size and strength negated by poor form and mounting frustration. When the session finally ended, Danny lingered near the training area while other recruits headed toward evening chow. His breathing was still elevated, but not from physical exertion. The calm competence that Zara had displayed throughout the exercise had shattered his fundamental assumptions about combat effectiveness. Marcus approached cautiously, uncertain how to address what they had all witnessed. "Danny, maybe we should talk about what happened during training." "What happened?" Danny replied through gritted teeth, is that little Miss Perfect got lucky with a few moves she probably learned watching YouTube videos. Real combat is different from training exercises. Tommy nodded reluctantly, though his conviction was clearly shaken. She definitely has some training background, maybe more than she is letting on. The admission hung in the air between them, acknowledgement of something they had been refusing to accept for weeks. Zara was not the helpless target they had assumed her to be, and their campaign of harassment was beginning to reveal more about their own inadequacies than hers. Danny turned to watch Zara as she cleaned her gear with characteristic attention to detail. Something about her composure under pressure reminded him of instructors he had encountered, professionals who carried themselves with quiet confidence born from genuine competence. "I don't care how much training she has had," he said finally. "This is about respect and knowing your place. Some lessons can't be taught in a classroom or a gym." But even as he spoke the words, Danny could feel the foundation of his assumptions crumbling beneath him. The easy victory he had expected in hand-to-hand combat had instead revealed his own limitations while highlighting capabilities he had not anticipated. Marcus and Tommy remained silent, processing their own observations from the training session. The comfortable certainty of their initial prejudices was giving way to uncomfortable questions about what they really knew about their target. As evening approached and the recruits prepared for another night in the barracks, the dynamics within Fireteam 3 had shifted once again. Danny's authority was eroding, his leadership undermined by repeated failures and escalating desperation. But rather than accepting defeat gracefully, he was doubling down on confrontation, his wounded pride demanding satisfaction regardless of the consequences. The breaking point was approaching rapidly, and everyone involved could sense the gathering storm. The fourth week of training brought advanced tactical exercises and the growing realization among 3rd Platoon that graduation was approaching rapidly. Most recruits had found their rhythm within the military structure, but the tension surrounding Fireteam 3 continued to escalate like pressure building in a sealed container. Danny's behavior had become increasingly erratic as his leadership failures mounted and his original assumptions about military hierarchy crumbled around him. Sleep deprivation and constant stress had stripped away his ability to maintain even the pretense of professionalism when dealing with Zara. During morning inspection, he deliberately sabotaged her bunk arrangement, loosening the hospital corners and disturbing the precise alignment that military standards demanded. When Staff Sergeant Santos discovered the irregularities, Zara accepted the reprimand without protest, though her eyes found Danny's with a look that conveyed perfect understanding of what had occurred. The sabotage escalated throughout the week as Danny recruited other recruits to participate in his campaign of harassment. Equipment went missing from her locker, her uniform buttons were loosened during field exercises, and her written assignments mysteriously disappeared from submission folders. Marcus and Tommy watched these developments with growing unease, their initial enthusiasm for tormenting her replaced by concern about the direction their alliance was heading. The pranks had moved beyond harmless hazing into territory that could result in serious disciplinary action. Tommy approached Marcus privately after evening chow, his voice low and worried. "This is getting out of hand. Danny is losing it completely, and we're going to get caught up in whatever he is planning next." Marcus nodded reluctantly, his own observations leading to similar conclusions. "She has not done anything to deserve this level of harassment. Actually, she helped me during the crucible when she could have just let me fail." The conversation was interrupted by Danny's approach, his face flushed with excitement about his latest scheme. "I've been thinking about our princess problem," he announced with barely contained glee. "Tonight after lights out, we're going to have a little conversation about respect and proper behavior." Both Marcus and Tommy recognized the dangerous undertone in his voice, the suggestion of something that went far beyond verbal intimidation. The weeks of accumulated frustration and wounded pride had pushed Danny toward a breaking point that threatened to destroy more than just his own military career. "What kind of conversation?" Marcus asked carefully, hoping to gauge the extent of Danny's intentions without appearing to challenge his authority directly. The kind that makes sure she understands her place in the food chain. Danny replied with a smile that contained no warmth. 6 Marines against 1 mouthy recruit. I think those are odds even she can understand. Tommy felt his stomach clench with sudden fear. 6 Marines? Who else is involved in this plan? Danny's smile widened as he revealed the extent of his conspiracy. Rodriguez from 2nd Platoon owes me a favor, and he is bringing Williams and Jackson. Combined with us 3, that should be enough to teach our little martial arts expert some humility. The scope of the planned confrontation shocked both Marcus and Tommy into silence. What had begun as crude harassment had evolved into something that resembled a gang assault, complete with recruits from other platoons willing to participate in Danny's vendetta. Marcus tried one last attempt at reason. Danny, if we get caught doing something like this, we will all be thrown out of the program. Is it really worth destroying our careers just to prove a point? The question seemed to trigger something violent in Danny's expression, his facade of control slipping to reveal the rage that had been building for weeks. She has already destroyed my career, he snarled. Every time she outperforms me, every time she makes me look incompetent, she is taking something away from me that I can never get back. Tommy stepped back involuntarily, suddenly aware that their leader had crossed a psychological line that separated rational anger from something much more dangerous. The military training that was supposed to build character and discipline had instead amplified Danny's worst impulses. As the evening progressed toward lights out, word spread quietly through the barracks about the planned confrontation. Some recruits expressed concern, while others seemed excited by the prospect of violence. The female recruits huddled together in frightened groups, understanding that they could easily become targets if this type of behavior was allowed to continue. Corporal Valdez made her final rounds through the sleeping area, her experienced eye noting the unusual tension that filled the space like smoke. Something was wrong with the normal rhythm of the barracks, but identifying the specific threat would require more investigation than her current duties allowed. Zara lay on her bunk fully aware of the whispered conversations and meaningful glances that surrounded her position. Her father had warned her about moments like this, when military discipline broke down and mob mentality took control. The next few hours would test everything he had taught her about survival and self-defense. She had hoped that consistent performance and professional behavior would eventually earn the respect of her fellow recruits. But Danny's psychological deterioration had created a situation that could not be resolved through patience and competence alone. As midnight approached and the barracks settled into uneasy quiet, Zara remained awake and alert, her senses tuned to detect the first signs of approaching danger. The confrontation that Danny had been building toward for weeks was finally at hand, and the true test of her abilities was about to begin. The barracks clock showed 0200 hours when Danny began his careful movement through the sleeping area, his recruits from 2nd Platoon having already positioned themselves near the emergency exits. Rodriguez, Williams, and Jackson had arrived during the shift change, their presence undetected by the skeleton crew of duty personnel. Marcus lay awake in his bunk, wrestling with a decision that would define his character for the rest of his military career. Every instinct told him that participating in this assault would cross a line from which there could be no return, but fear of Danny's retaliation kept him paralyzed with indecision. Tommy had made his choice hours earlier, quietly informing Corporal Valdez about the planned confrontation during her final inspection rounds. His conscience would not allow him to participate in what amounted to a premeditated attack on a fellow Marine, regardless of the personal consequences. Valdez had listened to his whispered report with growing alarm, recognizing the potential for serious injury or worse if 6 male recruits cornered a single female target. She immediately contacted Staff Sergeant Santos through the emergency communication system, but military bureaucracy moved slowly even in crisis situations. Danny approached Zara's bunk with predatory satisfaction, confident that 6 against 1 odds would finally provide the decisive victory that had eluded him through weeks of legitimate competition. His conspirators formed a loose circle around her sleeping area, blocking potential escape routes while maintaining plausible deniability about their coordinated presence. Rodriguez carried a small flashlight that cast eerie shadows across the sleeping faces of uninvolved recruits, most of whom had awakened to the unusual activity but remained motionless in their bunks. The smart ones understood that witnessing this confrontation could make them targets for future retaliation. Williams and Jackson flanked the foot of her bunk while Danny positioned himself near the head, his bulk casting a massive shadow over her apparently sleeping form. The moment had arrived for him to reclaim the respect and authority that her superior performance had systematically undermined. "Time to wake up, princess," he whispered harshly while reaching toward her shoulder. "We need to have that conversation about knowing your place in the hierarchy." His hand never made contact with her body. In one fluid motion that seemed to defy the laws of physics, Zara rolled off the far side of her bunk and landed in a combat crouch, her movements so quick and controlled that Danny's brain struggled to process what had occurred. She had been awake for hours, tracking their movements through sound and peripheral vision while maintaining the appearance of deep sleep. Her father's lessons about situational awareness and tactical positioning had prepared her for exactly this type of scenario. The 6 Marines found themselves facing someone whose posture and bearing had transformed completely from the quiet recruit they had been harassing for weeks. This was not the same person who had absorbed their verbal abuse without response or endured their sabotage attempts with stoic patience. Danny blinked in confusion, his carefully planned ambush having immediately gone off script. The element of surprise was supposed to be theirs, not hers. How had she detected their approach and prepared a counter-response before he had even made his move? Rodriguez stepped forward with his flashlight, attempting to regain the initiative through intimidation. "6 of us, 1 of you. Simple mathematics, even someone like you should be able to understand." Zara's voice carried a calm authority that seemed to fill the entire sleeping area when she responded. "Mathematics assumes equal variables. That assumption might be incorrect." The cryptic response sent a chill through Marcus, who recognized something in her tone that suggested knowledge and capabilities far beyond basic military training. This was not the voice of a victim preparing to be overwhelmed by superior numbers. Williams attempted to circle behind her, while Jackson moved to cut off her path toward the main exit, but their movements were clumsy and telegraphed compared to her precise positioning. Years of training had taught her to track multiple opponents simultaneously while maintaining optimal defensive angles. Danny finally found his voice, though it carried less confidence than he had anticipated. "You think you are some kind of martial arts expert? This is not a movie where the underdog gets to prove everyone wrong through mystical fighting skills." "Actually," Zara replied, while shifting her weight into a stance that none of them recognized, "this is exactly that kind of situation. You should have done more research before making assumptions about who you were targeting." The admission hung in the air like an electric charge, confirmation of what some had begun to suspect, but none had been willing to acknowledge. She was not just another recruit struggling to meet military standards, but someone whose background included training that went far beyond weekend self-defense classes. Jackson made the first aggressive move, lunging forward with the clumsy enthusiasm of someone whose fighting experience came primarily from barroom brawls and street altercations. His attack was powerful but predictable, exactly the type of assault she had been trained to counter since childhood. What happened next would be discussed in whispered conversations throughout Camp Lejeune for years to come, as 6 confident Marines discovered that their fundamental assumptions about combat effectiveness were about to be shattered in the most dramatic way possible. Jackson's lunge carried all the force his 200-pound frame could generate, but his technique was fundamentally flawed by overconfidence and poor balance. Zara sidestepped his attack with minimal effort, using his momentum against him as she guided his trajectory into the steel frame of an adjacent bunk. The impact resonated through the barracks like a gunshot as Jackson's shoulder connected with unforgiving metal, his cry of pain awakening every recruit who had been pretending to sleep. He crumpled to the floor, clutching his arm, effectively removing himself from the confrontation before it had truly begun. Williams reacted to his partner's immediate defeat with a wild haymaker that telegraphed its intention from across the sleeping area. Zara ducked beneath the clumsy punch and delivered a precise strike to his solar plexus that dropped him to his knees, gasping for air that refused to enter his lungs. Rodriguez attempted to blind her with his flashlight while simultaneously grabbing for her arm, but the beam only served to illuminate his own poor positioning. She trapped his wrist in a joint lock that sent the flashlight clattering across the floor, then applied pressure that forced him face first into the nearest wall. The entire sequence had taken less than 15 seconds, transforming Danny's carefully planned 6-on-1 ambush into a 3-on-1 confrontation that was rapidly deteriorating in his favor. Marcus stood frozen near his own bunk, unable to process the speed and efficiency with which 3 grown men had been neutralized. Danny finally overcame his shock and launched himself forward with the desperation of someone whose entire worldview was crumbling in real time. His football training gave him power and aggression, but no understanding of how to fight an opponent who possessed superior technique and tactical awareness. Zara absorbed his charge by redirecting his energy into a hip throw that sent his massive frame sailing through the air before landing hard on the concrete floor. The sound of his impact echoed through the barracks like thunder, followed by groans of pain that confirmed the effectiveness of her counterattack. Tommy had positioned himself near the main entrance, torn between his desire to help and his awareness that intervention might only make things worse. The systematic destruction of Danny's assault team was both terrifying and magnificent to witness, a demonstration of capabilities that defied everything they had been taught about physical confrontation. Rodriguez struggled to his feet with blood streaming from his nose, his earlier confidence replaced by the dawning realization that they had severely underestimated their target. This was not the helpless victim they had planned to intimidate, but a trained fighter whose skills exceeded anything they had encountered. Williams remained on his knees, fighting for breath, while Jackson continued to clutch his damaged shoulder, both effectively removed from any continued hostilities. The mathematical advantage that had seemed so decisive moments earlier had evaporated like morning mist under the harsh light of reality. Danny rolled over with difficulty, his ribs screaming in protest from his impact with the floor. The woman standing over him bore no resemblance to the quiet recruit who had endured weeks of harassment without significant response. This was someone whose training and background had prepared her for exactly this type of scenario. Marcus finally found his voice, though it emerged as barely more than a whisper. "Who are you really?" Zara remained in her combat stance, alert for any renewed aggression while scanning the immediate area for additional threats. "My name is Corporal Zara Blackwood," she replied calmly. "My father is Colonel James Blackwood, and my grandfather was Sergeant Major William Blackwood, Medal of Honor recipient for Vietnam." The revelation hit the remaining conscious attackers like a physical blow. They had been harassing the daughter of military royalty, someone whose family name carried weight and respect throughout the Marine Corps hierarchy. Their campaign of intimidation had targeted someone whose credentials and connections far exceeded their own. But more than that, her fluid movements and devastating effectiveness suggested training that went beyond family military tradition. This was someone who had been prepared from childhood for exactly these types of confrontations, whose skills had been honed through years of dedicated practice. Rodriguez wiped blood from his face while struggling to understand how their intelligence gathering had failed so completely. No one had mentioned her family background or combat training during the weeks of planning that had led to this disaster. Danny attempted to stand, but found his legs unsteady beneath him, the pain in his ribs making breathing difficult. His dreams of putting her in her place had transformed into a nightmare that would haunt him for the rest of his military career, assuming he still had one after tonight. The sound of approaching footsteps echoed through the corridor outside the barracks, suggesting that help was finally arriving for a confrontation that had already reached its conclusion. Staff Sergeant Santos and Corporal Valdez burst through the entrance with emergency lighting that illuminated a scene of chaos and defeat. 6 male Marines lay scattered across the sleeping area in various states of injury and humiliation, while one female recruit stood calmly in the center of the destruction, apparently unharmed by the confrontation that had just concluded. Santos surveyed the scene with the experienced eye of someone who had witnessed similar incidents throughout his career, though rarely with such a decisive outcome in favor of the outnumbered defender. His assessment of the situation would determine the consequences for everyone involved in this midnight assault. Staff Sergeant Santos stood in the doorway, absorbing the scene before him with the measured calm of a career Marine who had witnessed every form of human behavior the military could produce. 6 male recruits lay scattered across the barracks floor in various states of injury, while Corporal Zara Blackwood stood at attention in the center of the chaos. Rodriguez struggled to his feet with blood still flowing from his broken nose, his earlier swagger replaced by the sullen demeanor of someone who understood that serious consequences were approaching rapidly. Williams remained doubled over fighting for breath, while Jackson cradled his damaged shoulder against his chest. Danny attempted to stand, but found his ribs protesting violently against any significant movement. The massive bruise forming across his torso would serve as a permanent reminder of the night he learned that assumptions about combat effectiveness could prove catastrophically wrong. Santos moved through the barracks with deliberate steps, his trained eye cataloging evidence while formulating the report that would determine everyone's future in the Marine Corps. The positioning of the injured recruits told a clear story about who had been the aggressor and who had been defending themselves. Corporal Valdez followed behind him with a medical kit, beginning triage on the wounded while maintaining professional detachment from the obvious implications of what had occurred. Her earlier conversation with Tommy had provided advance warning, but the actual scope of the confrontation exceeded her worst expectations. The name Blackwood carried significant weight throughout military circles, and Santos recognized the family connection immediately. Colonel James Blackwood was legendary for his service in Afghanistan, while Sergeant Major William Blackwood's Medal of Honor citation was required reading at the War College. Marcus emerged from his position near the wall, where he had remained frozen throughout the entire confrontation. His face reflected the internal struggle between loyalty to his original alliance and growing respect for someone who had just demonstrated capabilities that redefined his understanding of combat effectiveness. Santos addressed the room with the authoritative voice that commanded immediate attention from every conscious recruit. Everyone who participated in this unauthorized confrontation will report to my office at 0600 hours for individual interviews. No discussion between now and then. Tommy stepped forward from his position near the entrance, his conscience demanding that he clarify his role in the evening's events. Staff Sergeant, I reported the planned assault to Corporal Valdez approximately 2 hours ago. I was not a willing participant in what happened here. The admission drew hostile glares from Rodriguez and Williams, who understood that Tommy's cooperation with authority would complicate their efforts to minimize the consequences of their actions. But Santos simply nodded acknowledgement while continuing his preliminary investigation. Jackson finally found his voice despite the pain radiating through his shoulder. She attacked us without provocation. We were just trying to talk to her about team dynamics, and she went crazy on us for no reason. The lie was so transparent that it insulted Santos's intelligence and experience. The evidence contradicted every aspect of Jackson's version, from the positioning of the injuries to the testimony he had already received from Tommy about the premeditated nature of the assault. Zara remained at attention throughout the questioning, her bearing and demeanor reflecting the military discipline that had been instilled through years of family tradition. She had not spoken since revealing her identity, understanding that any additional comments would be inappropriate until formally questioned. Santos approached her position with the respect due to someone whose family had earned legendary status within the Marine Corps. Corporal Blackwood, are you injured and do you require medical attention? No, sir, she replied crisply. I am uninjured and ready for duty. Her response demonstrated the kind of professional bearing that Santos expected from experienced Marines, not fresh recruits still struggling to adapt to military culture. The contrast with her attackers was stark and telling about their respective backgrounds and preparation. Rodriguez made one final attempt to control the narrative, his voice distorted by his broken nose, but still carrying defiant anger. This whole situation started because she refused to respect the natural hierarchy that exists in every military unit. Some people need to learn their place. The comment revealed more about Rodriguez's character than he intended, confirming that the assault had been motivated by prejudice and wounded pride rather than any legitimate military concern. Santos filed the admission away for inclusion in his formal report. Danny remained silent on the floor, finally understanding that his campaign against Zara had been doomed from the beginning by his fundamental misunderstanding of who she was and what she represented. The quiet recruit he had targeted for harassment was actually military aristocracy whose credentials exceeded his own by several orders of magnitude. Medical personnel arrived to transport the more seriously injured attackers to the base hospital for proper treatment. Jackson's shoulder required immediate attention, while Rodriguez's nose needed professional setting to prevent permanent disfigurement. As the barracks began to empty of emergency personnel and wounded recruits, Santos prepared to begin the formal investigation that would determine the final consequences for everyone involved. The incident would be documented and reported up the chain of command, where decisions about careers and futures would be made by officers who understood the implications of attacking a Blackwood. Zara maintained her position at attention, ready to provide whatever testimony and cooperation the investigation required. Her father had prepared her for this moment, explaining that actions taken in self-defense must always be justified through proper military channels. The transformation of 3rd Platoon's dynamics was complete, with former alliances shattered and new respect patterns emerging from the ashes of Danny's failed assault. The remaining weeks of training would proceed under fundamentally different circumstances for everyone involved. The investigation proceeded with military efficiency throughout the following morning as Colonel Patricia Hayes arrived from division headquarters to personally oversee the proceedings. Her presence signaled the serious nature of the incident and the high-level attention it had attracted within the command structure. Danny sat in the medical bay with his ribs wrapped in compression bandages, finally understanding the magnitude of his miscalculation. The woman he had targeted for weeks of harassment was not just any recruit, but the granddaughter of a Medal of Honor recipient and daughter of one of the most respected colonels in the Marine Corps. Rodriguez faced potential court-martial proceedings for his role in organizing the assault, his broken nose serving as a visible reminder of the night he learned that military tradition and family legacy carried real consequences. His dreams of a career in the Marines were evaporating like smoke in the Carolina morning air. Jackson's shoulder required surgery to repair the damage from his impact with the bunk frame, effectively ending his participation in the current training cycle. Williams had recovered his breathing, but faced disciplinary action that would likely result in discharge from the program before graduation. Marcus sat across from Staff Sergeant Santos in the interview room, his voice barely above a whisper as he recounted his role in the weeks of harassment that had led to the midnight confrontation. His conscience demanded complete honesty about his participation in the systematic targeting of a fellow Marine. I went along with Danny because I thought she was just another recruit trying to prove herself, he admitted with obvious shame. I never imagined she had the background and training to defend herself the way she did. We completely underestimated who we were dealing with. Santos recorded every detail of Marcus's testimony, building a comprehensive picture of the premeditated harassment campaign that had culminated in coordinated assault. The evidence was overwhelming, and the consequences would be severe for everyone involved. Tommy's cooperation with the investigation earned him consideration for reduced punishment, though his initial participation in the harassment would still result in disciplinary action. His decision to report the planned assault had potentially prevented more serious injuries and demonstrated the kind of moral courage the Marines sought to develop. Colonel Hayes interviewed Zara personally. Her questions focused on the family background and training that had enabled such a decisive defensive response. The conversation revealed years of preparation under her father's guidance, including advanced martial arts training and tactical awareness instruction. "Your father called me this morning," Hayes informed her with professional respect. "He wanted to ensure that you were receiving appropriate support during the investigation process. The Marine Corps takes care of its own, especially when they demonstrate the kind of character you showed last night." Zara maintained her formal bearing throughout the interview, but gratitude was evident in her response. "Thank you, ma'am. My family has always taught me that actions speak louder than words, and that respect must be earned through consistent performance rather than demanded through intimidation." The investigation expanded beyond Camp Lejeune as word of the incident reached higher command levels. General Morrison himself requested a full report on the circumstances that had led to 6 male recruits attempting to assault the granddaughter of one of the Corps' most decorated veterans. Public affairs officers prepared statements explaining that appropriate disciplinary action was being taken while protecting the privacy of those involved. The incident had the potential to become a public relations nightmare if details leaked to civilian media outlets. Danny faced the most serious consequences as the primary organizer of the harassment campaign and assault. His dreams of becoming a Marine were effectively over, replaced by the reality of criminal charges and potential imprisonment for his role in the coordinated attack. The other recruits in 3rd Platoon watched the proceedings with a mixture of fascination and fear, understanding that their own futures hung in the balance, depending on their level of involvement in the harassment. Some had participated actively while others had remained silent witnesses. Gunnery Sergeant Morrison emerged as a key witness whose observations of the developing situation provided crucial context for the investigation. His professional assessment of Zara's capabilities and the escalating harassment helped establish the premeditated nature of the assault. The transformation within 3rd Platoon was immediate and dramatic as former dynamics completely reversed. Recruits who had previously avoided Zara now sought opportunities to demonstrate respect and support, understanding that her family connections made future relationships with her potentially valuable. Marcus approached her during evening chow with obvious nervousness, his earlier hostility replaced by genuine remorse for his participation in the harassment campaign. "I wanted to apologize for everything that happened over the past few weeks," he said quietly. "I was wrong about you, and I am sorry for my part in making your training experience more difficult." Zara accepted his apology with the grace that her military upbringing had instilled, understanding that redemption was possible for those willing to acknowledge their mistakes and commit to better behavior. The Marine Corps was about transformation and second chances for those who demonstrated genuine change. As the investigation neared its conclusion, the final consequences began to take shape. Some careers would end in disgrace, while others might continue under strict supervision and probationary status. The incident would serve as a cautionary tale about the dangers of prejudice and assumptions within military culture. The remaining weeks of training would proceed under the shadow of these events, with new leadership structures emerging from the ashes of Danny's failed assault. Respect and hierarchy would be rebuilt on foundations of demonstrated competence rather than intimidation and harassment. Graduation day at Camp Lejeune arrived with the crisp autumn air that marked the changing of seasons and the transformation of civilians into United States Marines. 3rd Platoon stood in formation wearing their dress blue uniforms, though their ranks had been significantly reduced by the consequences of the midnight assault 3 weeks earlier. Danny was absent from the ceremony, his military career having ended in disgrace with a dishonorable discharge and pending civilian criminal charges for assault. His dreams of Marine Corps service had been destroyed by his inability to accept that competence and character mattered more than gender or preconceived notions about hierarchy. Rodriguez faced similar consequences, his leadership role in organizing the attack resulting in court-martial proceedings that would likely end with imprisonment and permanent separation from military service. The broken nose had healed, but the damage to his reputation and future would last forever. Jackson recovered from his shoulder surgery, but was recycled to a future training class, his graduation delayed by months while he completed physical rehabilitation. Williams had been discharged for his participation in the assault, his brief military career ending before it had truly begun. Marcus stood in formation wearing the coveted eagle, globe, and anchor that marked his successful completion of Marine Corps training. His cooperation with the investigation and genuine remorse for his earlier behavior had earned him a second chance, though he would serve under probationary status for his first year of active duty. Tommy had also earned his place among the new Marines, his moral courage in reporting the planned assault having mitigated the consequences of his initial participation in the harassment campaign. The experience had taught him valuable lessons about standing up for what was right even when facing peer pressure. Colonel Hayes served as the reviewing officer for the graduation ceremony, her presence lending additional significance to an event that was already emotionally charged for the surviving members of 3rd Platoon. The investigation had elevated this particular graduation beyond routine ceremony into something approaching military legend. When Zara's name was called, she marched forward with the precise bearing that had characterized her entire training experience. But now her fellow Marines understood that her composure and competence came from a lifetime of preparation rather than natural talent or good fortune. Colonel Hayes personally pinned the eagle, globe, and anchor on her uniform, a gesture that carried symbolic weight throughout the assembled crowd. "Your grandfather would be proud of the Marine you have become," she said loud enough for nearby ranks to hear. "Your family's legacy of service continues with distinction." The ceremony continued with traditional speeches about honor, courage, and commitment, but the words carried special meaning for those who had witnessed firsthand how these values played out under extreme pressure. The events of recent weeks had transformed abstract concepts into lived reality. Marcus approached Zara after the formal ceremonies concluded, his new Marine uniform crisp and properly fitted despite the circumstances that had nearly prevented him from earning the right to wear it. "Thank you for helping me during the Crucible March," he said with genuine gratitude. "That moment of teamwork taught me more about being a Marine than anything else that happened during training." Zara accepted his thanks with the same grace she had shown throughout the ordeal, understanding that redemption was possible for those willing to learn from their mistakes. The Marine Corps was built on the principle that people could change and grow beyond their initial limitations. Tommy joined their conversation, his own gratitude evident in his expression and posture. "I learned something important about moral courage from watching how you handled everything," he admitted. "Standing up for what is right, even when facing overwhelming opposition, takes a special kind of strength." The 3 new Marines stood together representing the complex dynamics that had shaped their shared experience. What had begun as harassment and hostility had evolved into mutual respect and understanding, though the journey had required painful lessons about prejudice and assumptions. Families began arriving for the celebration that traditionally followed graduation ceremonies, and Zara's parents appeared with obvious pride in their daughter's achievement. Colonel James Blackwood wore his dress uniform with the ribbons and decorations that marked his distinguished career, while her mother carried herself with the quiet dignity of a military spouse. The reunion was emotional for all involved, as her parents had followed the investigation proceedings with concern for both her safety and the potential impact on her military career. Her successful navigation of the crisis had demonstrated the effectiveness of their preparation and guidance. Staff Sergeant Santos approached the family group with professional respect, his assessment of recent events having elevated his opinion of Zara's character and potential. "Your daughter conducted herself with exceptional professionalism throughout a very difficult situation," he informed her parents. "She has the qualities we look for in future Marine leaders." As the day progressed and families celebrated their new Marines, the lessons of recent weeks began to crystallize into lasting wisdom about respect, hierarchy, and the true meaning of military service. The Corps had survived another test of its values and emerged stronger for having faced the challenge honestly. If this story of hidden strength and earned respect moved you, please drop a comment about your favorite moment or character, or share if you have witnessed similar courage overcoming prejudice in your own experience. These stories remind us that assumptions about others can be dangerous, and that true strength often comes from unexpected sources. The eagle, globe, and anchor on Zara's uniform represented more than personal achievement. It symbolized the triumph of character over prejudice and the validation of principles that had guided her family for generations. The young woman who had endured weeks of harassment had become a Marine whose reputation would precede her throughout her military career.